First impressions are important, and if you're someone like me, they can be a bit intimidating. Even if you don't think the world is constantly watching and judging your every move, a first impression is probably one of the few times said anxiety-inducing thoughts are most justified. Things can obviously be course-corrected, but everybody wants to come off as their best self the first time around. I think this is also largely true in the world of entertainment. A rocky start to a series or movie isn't necessarily a death sentence, but if you fail at intriguing or engaging your audience early on, you're going to lose people. And when dealing with anime, I think the desire for a good first impression is all the more evident given how the animation quality for a lot of series can tend to decrease the longer it goes on. Note I said can because I want to make clear it's by no means universal, but it's also not terribly uncommon either. That's an entirely separate conversation though. For this video, we're sticking to those first 22 to 24 minutes and how several series choose to handle them. The one we're starting off with, Island, in particular is an example on many levels of how not to handle a first episode. So, let's discuss. Okay, so where do we start? Well, I guess the beginning is as good a place as any.
私、壊れちゃうかも。
If I wasn't on a watch list before, I definitely am now. But you know what? This is a good time to explain that this series is structured around mysteries and time travel, and so the scene might be fine in context. But hey, we're not overly concerned with context because we're judging just the first episode. And we don't learn what was with this whole exchange by the end, so hooray for perpetual ambiguity. I mean, it's probably not worse than what I'm imagining, but the fact it made me imagine that in the first place is worth a bit of annoyance. But regardless, yeah, that's the hook they decide to open with. It's not the worst that comes to mind. You've got the opening scene of Show Bitch and My First Girlfriend is Demonetized certainly in contention, but all three are using varying degrees of fan service and shock value to get you to keep watching. And at least for me, I don't like that tactic. Especially when, in Island's case, it's probably not going to be relevant for a while if I had to guess. Anyway, we've talked enough about these first 10 seconds. Next, we are shown the title card in the corner, and then some shots of a beach, and rocks, and then our main character. And you know, after rewatching this episode a few times, I realized something. There are actually no establishing shots of the island itself. There are plenty of shots of the coastline, and this here is the best glimpse we get as to the size of the titular location. But really, if we weren't told several times, hey, we're on an island, I've got to save this island, this is a mysterious island, there's nothing that conveys that it's an island until the very end of the OP at the end of this first episode. Show don't tell isn't an unbreakable rule, but you'd think when it's the actual name of your series, you might want to give us some idea of what we're working with, especially when it's something that can be accomplished with less than a handful of shots. I am being a little harsh, even for me, but I think this is also just emblematic of a larger problem, that being lackluster directing in general in this first episode. The most impressive shot by far is this one right here, and even then it feels like the song is supposed to be the main hook of this scene rather than the direction, which would explain the overall lack of complex cinematography in this sequence minus what I mentioned. And a lot of other shots in this episode just fail to convey really anything of significance. With the exception of a decent use of wide shots here and there and the aforementioned singing scene, a lot of the direction just feels flat and static to me. Just watch this bit here and tell me what it's supposed to communicate. Or this shot, and this one. You get the idea. But moving on, after we get a few shots of our supposed main character, we get a short bit with one of the main girls walking to school with her friends before she decides to head off at random saying she forgot something at home. Instead, she makes her way to the ocean, because plot reasons I guess, and spots our MC on the beach. Doing what any sane person would do, she rushes down to check on him and... Okay, 1. Ouch. I mean, there's no way that wouldn't hurt, right? 2. Why? Just what purpose does this scene serve? I guess it's supposed to be funny, but to me it just comes off as dumb and makes me feel a tad bit uncomfortable just watching. The accidental boob grab trope is one thing, but tripping face first onto his junk? Clearly they're trying to up the ante, but I will kindly fold. Yeah, this was the point that I think consigned Island to the seasonal anime graveyard for me. But, like this episode, we are far from done. because we've still got to meet a guy in contention for the worst animated cop of all time. Sure, he does his due diligence interviewing the mysterious amnesia-inflicted man who I'll now refer to as Setsuna, but then this moment happens.
それから誰かをいや誰かを殺す
ところで
At first I thought he said it enough under his breath that Officer Dumbass here didn't catch it, but his phrasing seems to imply he's just brushing it off. I mean, you seem to be taking Setsuna's claim that he's from the future rather seriously, but he drops a premeditated murder motive in your lap and you act like it's nothing? Ugh. But after I finished watching the entire thing, I realized this scene is kind of a microcosm of what's wrong with this initial episode. Almost nothing about Setsuna's interactions with anyone this first episode feels organic or even natural in the slightest. And I mean that within the rules the narrative sets for itself. His end goal is set up, but there's no real weight given to it or how it'll be accomplished. Because Setsuna is one of the mysteries of the island, of the show. For this first episode, and I'm guessing most of the series, that will be the case. Thus, this first installment decides to bend over backwards to accommodate him into this story and introduce him to everyone important in these first 24 minutes. Now to clarify, that's not inherently a bad thing. Deku meets All Might Episode 1, Gon meets Leorio and Kurapika, Alba meets the majority of Eagle Jump, Kimari meets Shirase, and you get the idea. We could be here all day listing off examples. But the difference between those and Island is that with Island, so much of the plot just effortlessly falls into Setsuna's lap. Sometimes literally. You can just kind of feel the visual novel's source material seeping through, where everything feels orchestrated for the main character. And again, in most stories, it's natural to follow the main character and have significant, sometimes life-changing events happen to them because they are the main character. But normally you have some incentive to give a shit about them. So you are okay with the fact that they are traveling down a route pre-planned by their creator. This leads me to my second biggest problem with this first episode that I touched on before. Setsuna being without his memories, aside from a convenient flashback or two, is devoid of really any significant personality traits. Rather, if he has any, he doesn't present them strongly. He's a walking mystery that is just bland and takes about everything that happens to him in stride, including his attempted assassination. He also doesn't put much effort into finding out who he is or what he's supposed to do, and so I don't really care about him or whatever he's being thrown into. And because of this, the majority of his interactions throughout this episode are then carried not by my interest in the conversation or characters, but by the designs of the girls, which are pretty good but not necessarily anything to write home about. It also doesn't help that, like Setsuna, they too don't have much in the way of personality. Two are varying degrees of tsundere, and one has a splash of yandere thrown in. To be fair, they might develop more later on, but to me, a character should leave an instant impression on you. I don't have to be immediately invested or even necessarily like them, but I should know what they're about. And with this, there's an inherent advantage that the animated format has. You can be over the top, you can be expressive, so do that. It doesn't matter how grounded, realistic, or serious your show is, that shouldn't prevent them from showing emotion. And so when you have characters only do that once or twice in your first episode, it just makes them feel all the more one-dimensional, like they were designed to act this way for the sake of the story and nothing else. Anyway, now for the fun part. The bit where I bring up good examples of how to handle first episodes. And after my last two installments of this series, I've come to learn something. It really doesn't matter what show I pick. Whatever I choose will generate Reagan levels of salt for someone. So with that in mind, f*** it. Let's compare it to Avatar. Now I want to make something clear before I hear comments about Avatar not being anime and therefore it's not an apt comparison. That is, I think the ideas of what make a good first episode are largely independent of genre or even medium. Your goal should be to engage your audience and get them invested in one way or another. So to that end, I could compare Island to Avatar, Steven Universe, or even Breaking Bad if I wanted to, and I know just saying that is gonna stir up a certain level of vitriol, but hey, that's why we have opinions. And don't worry, my examples are staying within animation because there are just more points of comparison when it comes to things like direction, character expressions, etc. So let's get into it. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, there is a general consensus that early Avatar feels a bit more lighthearted and like a kid's show compared to the places the series goes later on. And I understand that sentiment, because there are definitely parts that feel very angled towards Nickelodeon's more typical audience. That being said, I still feel Avatar's initial episode deserves praise, even in spite of it being the first of a two-parter. Is it perfect? No. Aang's realization that he's been frozen for 100 years and that everyone he knew is likely dead gets kinda brushed off quickly. Wow, you've been gone 100 years. Well, we should get going. Yeah, honestly, just a fade to another scene to show some indication of time passing would have helped solve that. But getting into what it does well, within the first minutes of our 5 principal characters appearing on screen, you immediately get a strong impression of their personality. Sure, they're a little over the top and closer to their Ember Island player counterparts, but that's not really a bad thing. Subtlety and depth can come later on. I don't think anybody expects or wants to know the entire machinations of a character's mind right out of the gate. After all, they are largely a mystery when you first meet them, and a strong introduction helps shatter that mystery as it fuels interactions and motivations for the rest of the episode. You start to understand character dynamics, and ultimately it helps you decide if you want to continue to follow these characters. So, when I'm presented with this guy, whose purpose is to be a walking mystery, I'm kind of at a loss for whether or not I should care. But back to Avatar, it can be hard to view a first episode in a vacuum after you already know how the series turns out. So trying not to view it retroactively, I think this first episode also demonstrates a keen sense of balance, mainly in overall tone. The scenes with Aang, Katara, and Sokka are largely lighthearted with an occasional touch of darker or serious implications. Zuko's scenes, on the other hand, are almost entirely serious with the occasional moment of levity provided by Uncle Iroh. And while balance isn't necessary for every series, when that idea is expressed quite blatantly in the opening monologue, it's good to see a first episode reflect said idea from a thematic angle. And I hear you typing now that I'm not being fair to Island, as maybe its main idea is mystery and the episode reflects that. But really, the episode doesn't dedicate much time to whatever the mystery actually is. We get some time travel technobabble, you know, from a 12-year-old, before the details are dismissed as unimportant, because I mean, why would they be when you're talking about science? And then a scene of Setsuna looking through a book before seeing a note that freaks him out because it says he must die. Which, this takes place after someone already tried to kill you, dude. Why is just a threat now getting to you? Also, side note, but who turns a page like this? Is that a thing people do? Just palm the page? Anyway, back on topic. Having a first episode themed around a mystery doesn't mean you have to sacrifice characterization to do so. Avatar has a layer of mystery to it surrounding Aang, but if you want a better example, just look at something like Steins, also adapted from a visual novel, involves time travel, and whose first episode is rightfully confusing due to a number of puzzles. But again, trying to look at the first episode by itself, the mystery and inherent uncertainty don't prevent the characters from being incredibly entertaining. If anything, they're able to carry you through the puzzle that is this initial installment. I know for me, that's one of the main reasons I wanted to keep watching. And on top of that, there's several moments of camera work and direction that puts anything Island's first episode has to offer to shame. I know I'll catch some flack because I'm comparing one of the highest rated series on MAL to this, but again, I'm looking at this episode independent of whatever context we get later on, grading it on its own merits as a self-contained experience. And in my opinion, on its own, it's a great first episode. It gives you both plot and character-driven reasons to keep watching. The same goes for Avatar. With Island, because it really doesn't commit enough to either, you at best have one of those. But even then, I've listed off enough reasons that made me not want to continue. As always, if you liked it, more power to you, but I couldn't be bothered. The longer I watched, the less invested I became, the more nitpicky I got, and it was all downhill from there. I don't need a first episode to be perfect, just interesting enough with characters whose journey or interactions I want to follow. I wasn't asking for much from this initial introduction to the series, but ultimately Island still let me down. Those are, though, just my thoughts, and I want to hear yours. What do you look for in a first episode? Is there a series this season or in general you've dropped after just one? Let me know down below. As always, thank you for watching, and an especially big thanks goes out to my awesome patrons, PenguinPandaZero, OverjoyedSoup, MVPino, James Morton, Mr. Idealist, Marbled Ranger, Julian Reyes, and everyone else whose support helps make videos like these possible. If you want to join those awesome people, subscribe, check out my t-shirts, or just see what other videos I have to offer, links are all on the screen right now or down below. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, ring that bell icon, but most importantly, stay awesome, and I'll see you next time.